I tried this in a tutorial, but it didn't make a difference. I think we probably won't have much impact anyway.
Okay, I'll just distribute handouts.
I do that. Thanks.
After the job is done. Okay, welcome to the second session. Is this working? Let's see. Should be. Okay.
Switched on.
I don't know. Let's see. The light is on. So I think it should be okay.
If we switch to the... Something's moving on.
That's us, yeah. So the video is fine.
Yeah, but I was saying on the, if you go back to the other thing.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh,
that's
good. Oh,
moved.
good. Excellent. Okay. Okay, so everyone, welcome back to the afternoon session, where I'm very glad to present and introduce Ben Slade of Utah, who's written quite a revolutionary thesis on the reason why we're all meeting here today. And he's going to give the first talk, joint work with Aniko Csirmaz, on adding meaning to Indo Aryan aspectual adverbials then and again, with comparison to Hungarian. Thank you.
All right, yeah, so I'm going to be looking at certain aspectual adverbials and particularly the connections between these adverbials. So essentially looking at Hindi pir, Nepali peri, which are ambiguous between then, as in after that, and again. And then when they're in combination with another particle, an adjective particle, they take on this meaning of still in the concessive sense. And so what we will propose is a templatic definition that's shared by the meanings, so that certain parts of these meanings change, certain parts of the definitions change in order to get the then meaning and the again meaning, but most of the core remains the same. And then I'll move on to a comparison with Hungarian, which exhibits some similar phenomena, and discuss some of the historical implications. So we have examples like this in Hindi and Nepali. So things like Ram Pir So Gaya, which is ambiguous between Ram slept then, after that, meaning after some other event, or Ram slept again. And similarly in Nepali with something like Virendra Peri Sutyo. And then the other one that I'm concentrating on is these collocations of particles, Pirdi in Hindi and Peripani in Nepali. So you have things like Sham Gunda hai, Pirdi mera dost hai. So Sham's a Gunda, a villain. Still, he's my friend. And similarly in Nepali with Peripani. So, yeah, and here's just a tabular representation of the same things in comparison to some of these other cells. So we see that, so pir in Hindi, peri in Nepali can mean then after that, and then they can also have this repetitive sense like again. Hindi also has this one specialized form that Nepali doesn't have pir se, which can only mean again. And then we have these concessive ones that are combined with these additive scalar particles, P and Pani, obviously. So to put this into the sort of context to trigger the then reading, so if we have something like Ramne Kanakadiya vo Pir Sogaya. So he had dinner, then he slept. Okay, or simply in Nepali. Okay, so our proposal for the definition for this then after that reading is that these elements are going to combine with an ordered scale of times, T, capital T, a specific time T, an eventuality E, and some saturated or semi-saturated predicate P. Right? And so it'll end up asserting simply that there is a P eventuality E at time T, okay? But then we have this presuppositional part here. And so what this will end up presupposing that there's another eventuality, Q, which occurs at time T star, and that T star precedes, the time T star precedes time T. But this Q element is going to be restricted. It has to be one of the focus alternatives to the P eventuality, right? And so the exact sort of restrictions on this will depend on what is focused. And so with then, what will be focused is some subconstituent, right? So just to skip ahead quickly. So if we have something like, John woke up, then he got dressed, then he had a shower, then Mary had one. So depending on exactly what element is stressed, that will give us our different focus alternatives. So assuming it's something like, then John woke up, the alternatives will be alternatives to the VP. So it might be, John went back to sleep, John had dinner, whatever. So the Q will be one of these. Okay? So in other words, it will be satisfied if there is such if that's consistent with the context. And in terms of where it would join, it would presumably occupy this position in the tree. Okay, so the other one then is the again one. Okay, so if we had a context in Hindi, like Ram ne button ko daba diya, kuch nahi hua, usne phir button ko daba diya. Okay, so Ram pushed the button, nothing happened, he pushed the button again. Similarly in Nepali with Peri. Okay, so then this would be what we would have for the repetitive sense, okay? Which ends up in fact being entirely identical, except that the only thing that's different is what is focused. And so what is under focus here is the time variable. So it's not some subconstituent, but rather the time variable. And so these alternatives here, the presupposed alternatives, the only way in which they're going to differ is the time that event is occurring. Right? So if this is something like John woke up again, it's going to assert that John woke up at time t, whatever the time is, and it's going to presuppose that there's some other q eventuality, and which is going to be one of the focus alternatives. So something like John woke up at time t1, John woke up at time t2, and we'll still have the same precedence requirement that time t star precede time t. So this then makes sense why they might use the same element for both of these meanings, in the sense that it just matters then what ends up being focused. Again, is slightly potentially more complicated in terms of its structure, in that we get different types of agains, like the repetitive again, which would join higher up, and that's where the sort of whole event is repeated. So something like, John woke up again means that there's a previous event of him waking up. But with the restrictive, where the again would merge into the structure lower down, is simply, but this would be where, say, the result ends up being repeated. So something like, John painted the door again could be true in the case that he didn't ever paint a door before, but the door was painted before, and he's just bringing about the situation where it is painted again. And so then we can generalize this template for Pir and Peri, and for other, like when we were looking at other languages, there would be other examples other than this, then and again. For Hungarian, for instance, different types of still, or for that matter, for English still or German noch, where there are a number of different stills, a number of different megs. Okay, we can also use this template for generalizing that. So the basic idea is that, so these are going to combine with some sort of scale, they're going to combine with some sort of scalar entity, and there's going to be some relation between those scalar entities that might be precedence relation or abutment relation or other ones. And then the other thing, which of course will vary, that we saw between then and again, is exactly what's focused, and so what the focus alternatives are, which will of course restrict what the other presupposed eventuality would be. Okay, so then coming back to the ones that we'd seen briefly before, these concessive still, where we get this combination of this Pir or Peri element plus an additive particle. So taking the Hindi one, so the Sham Gunda hai, Pir bhi mera dost hai. So the Sham is a villain, still he's my friend. And so the interesting thing here is that these elements, P and Pani, are these additive particles. They're members of this class of quantifier particles. And we might call these, following Mitrović's classification of them, the mu type, right? Named after Japanese mo, okay, which appear in universal and conjunctive environments. Okay? And so here we see, from a number of languages, elements from this series. Okay? okay, which include Nepali Pani, Hindi P, and Hungarian Ish. And so these have, outside of this concessive still construction, of course, these have some of the sorts of uses that you would expect. So if you add them, they can function as additive or scalar elements. So something like Ram P Margaya, so this is Ram also died, or even Ram died. Okay. Similarly in Nepali, so this is 11 and 13. Similarly in Nepali with Ram Pani Mario. And you can also do essentially if you do the X, P, Y, P, you can get the both X and Y, because that's the 12 and 14. Some other interesting ways they combine. So if you combine these with a WH word, so this is in 15 and 17, you'll get an NPI. And if you combine these with a relative pronoun, as in 16 and 18, then you will get one of these ever-type relatives. Okay, so then here is the definition for the concessive, okay, which ends up involving more elements. So it's not just the templatic one. So it's the templatic one, but plus extra stuff, okay, and extra stuff being contributed by this additive particle. So in addition to this presupposed eventuality, which is restricted by, determined from the alternatives to the asserted eventuality, and we also have yet another eventuality which is presupposed, and that's the R1 up here. Okay. And if we're looking at, to take this one as an example, Sham's a villain, still he's my friend. The R would be the Ram's a villain. So this is this other eventuality which is relevant to the context. Okay. And for the focus alternatives, what's going to be focused here is verum. And so the two alternatives is going to be the asserted eventuality and the negation of that. And the relational component is going to be in terms of likelihood of these events. And so this bit here essentially says, so the aggregate likelihood, so that is you take the likelihood for all of these worlds and you add them together in some way. So it would be some sort of natural number that represents the combined likelihood for these. So it's the likelihood of worlds that are consistent with the speaker's knowledge in which this R eventuality and the P eventuality both occur. So in this case, it's the likelihood of those worlds in which Sham is a villain, and that's true, and it's true that Sham is my friend. So the likelihood of all of those worlds is less than the likelihood of the worlds in which Sham is a villain is true, and it is not the case that Sham is my friend is true. And presumably the concessive, at least one of the places you could join is a join at this aspect level. So again, so the sense is we see these additional elements beyond the templatic one that we saw, and this makes sense because we have this additional element, this additional new element, this additive scalar B or Pani. And so part of this additive seems to be to contribute this additional, the presupposition of this additional eventuality, which is this sort of framing one. And it also, given that there's likelihood, it seems that it's drawing on something about the scalar nature that these particles can have, right? Because we have this summation of likelihood over worlds that's being compared. Okay, so looking cross-linguistically, if we compare Hungarian, so there's some things that are a bit different. So we don't have an element that means then and again. That's sort of ambiguous between then and again in Hungarian. But we do have this meg, which it has a number of different interpretations, one of them being temporal still, other ones being something like a marginal still, and so on. This one etymologically does show up in the repetitive. Right, so we get pieces of this in the repetitive. Right, so we get this megint, this kishmeg. So these meg elements are showing back up. And in fact, in earlier forms of Hungarian, you could actually get meg as again. And meg is somehow etymologically connected to meg. The interesting thing then is what we find that it really does look parallel is in this concessive still. So just as we have the this peer plus b, this peer element plus this additive particle for the concessive still. For Hungarian, we have this meg element plus ish, this additive particle. So that's what I was talking about with the etymological connection between those. Example of concessive interpretation in Hungarian with this meg-ish. So very much like what we saw for the Hindi and Nepali. So it sets up, given this eventuality, this other eventuality is unlikely. And the additives in Hungarian it's similar to what happens in Hindi and Nepali, in that they can have this interpretation of also, and you can have this x-ish, y-ish construction, gives you both x and y. And we do get ish does appear in these other scalar environments where you get meg plus something and then ish, where you get sort of even, this even interpretation. So one of the interesting things is, so Hungarian meg doesn't mean then, but it does have this temporal ordering use, which seems to be the inverse of the relation in Indo Aryan. So it seems to be, so the then we get in Indo Aryan means something like like after that. And meg seems to be able to have this before that reading. So it says, okay, the asserted event is occurring before some other event. So we could, of course, the template could handle that very easily. It would look the same as our then template, except the relation here would be inverted. Yeah, and as I was alluding to earlier, just as in English and German, so meg, not only does it mean temporal still, but it occurs in these other contexts. So you can have something that's still bigger. Right? That would work with meg. You have this marginal one where you can say something is, Sopron is still in Hungary. Right? This marginal interpretation and so on. And those two, we could adjusting that template, we could capture those as well. Yeah, and if we want to fit this into a wider typology, we can look not only at Hungarian, but also at German, where similar to Hungarian, we end up with German noch is seemingly polysemous in similar ways, but with polysemy that still there's some sort of core to it that's very similar. All right, in terms of historical developments in the sense of where do these particles come from? So pir in Hindi is related to a verb that occurs in Hindi, pirna, to turn, which is derivable from a form pirati, which means to wander, move, or to turn, or to return. Right. In other Indo-Aryan languages, such as Kuchi Gujarati, we have this element pacho, which is, again, polysemous in this sort of way. So it's not between then and again, but between again and back. And this one's interesting in terms of etymology. It derives from an earlier form, pascha, which would mean the hinder part of something, so literally the back part of a creature. Right? Which has a nice parallel in Hindi in the form vapas, which is actually a loan word from Persian, but this pas part is actually cognate, ultimately. That it's the Iranian counterpart of pascha, for back. And this seems to be a fairly common development, or at least it's one I've noticed in a number of different languages, where you start off with something that means back, and often comes from something that literally means the back of a creature. Or in the case of English, again, which originally meant back, and you can sort of see this preserved in against, right, which still sort of maintains that meaning. That you have something which means back, at some point in time it then acquires this repetitive sense, and then these very frequently then lose the ability to mean back anymore. Just as in, so English again, for instance, up until at least the 1700s, maybe a bit later, you could use again to mean back, but that eventually fell out. Nepali Pani, so this is the correspondent of Hindi pir, is actually derives from Sanskrit nurati, which is a combination of the two particles. So Hunar being, well, we'll see this one. This is another one of these polysemous ones, which could mean a number of things like again, or back, or moreover, and so on. And then Upi, which is one of these additive or additive scalar elements. Yeah, and here are some examples of Sanskrit Hunar from various stages where we get it meaning again, or back, or something like moreover, or things we would get it meaning something like concessive still. So that we have an example where someone's saying, you know, it's not that amazing that somebody who has inherited wealth should become wealthy, but still I achieve prosperity without any wealth. And we find other instances of things that are similar. So it's not always the same elements that are involved in the polysemy, but for instance, with Old English eft, so this is a form that can mean again, but it also can mean something like afterwards. So again, that's sort of after that interpretation. Right, as I mentioned earlier, so Hungarian meg occurs with these different senses, the temporal still, and so on. And it does come from this particle meg, which if we go back to early Hungarian, we can see that it just has the sense of again. So even if synchronically we don't find exactly the same situation where we have again as an active meaning in Hungarian, in an earlier stage it was there. And this one, rather like what we saw from Hindi and Nepali and English and so on, it seems that the original meaning of meg was something like back. You get it in these constructions about returning and so on. This one is obviously not sort of a synchronically active one, but even in German, so German noch historically contains an additive part of the part of noch, ultimately derives from the Proto-Indo-European que. So in a lot of these cases, we sort of see this sort of layering where, at least at some stage, this was synchronically active, and sometimes we then see the residue of this later on. Don't have a lot of time to talk about other accounts, but there are, of course, previous accounts which look at a number of these elements, which look at, for instance, different interpretations of still, like Michalis, or Ippolito, who looks not only at still, but also at things like again. And they do in some cases. So Beck, in particular, does try to come up with a translation for still and noch, which is sort of compatible with these different functions. And she does something not dissimilar to what we're doing, where she essentially does what can be different. It can be different scales that are involved. One of the things, though, is that a number of these accounts seem to assume restrictions that don't seem to hold. So, for instance, in the Michalis account, she suggests that there is an abutment requirement for all of these different senses of still, and that's one that doesn't actually seem to be required. So you don't get it, for instance, in some of these marginality interpretations. There doesn't seem to be any sort of abutment requirement, in fact. A more minor point about Beck's claims about still implicates, she suggests that still implicates it'll be raining in the future, but that doesn't actually seem to be a necessary inference, because if you say something like this dress is still expensive, that doesn't mean that you expect that there necessarily would be some point in the future where it will ever be cheaper. All right, so the idea then is that we can sort of connect these different meanings that where we see that there are words that are synchronically sort of polysemous in this particular way, or that are historically that we saw that they could mean other things earlier, with this sort of templatic approach that we suggested, with the ability to then to sort of tweak these particular parts of it. So that is, in other words, what is the scale involved? What is the relation involved? Which things are focused? Which things are in focus, and thus which sorts of alternatives are accessible? And this could be useful in other cases where we've got some sort of fluidity between things. For instance, for prepositional things that are often fluid between spatial and temporal realms. Right? And so this could be, in general, then a useful way of understanding not only sort of morphologically connected things synchronically, but also historical relations. There are still things to do, so one of the things is to more fully work out the syntax and exactly how the composition would work. Because in a lot of cases, obviously, it matters exactly where it's, at what level it's composing, and so it'll interact with things in different ways. And similarly, it would be important to sort of figure out exactly what the contribution of P and Pani is in this concessive still, to have a more compositional account of what's going on. It may not be synchronically compositional, but at least to propose something that would have been active at some prior stage, perhaps. There's also some question about Hungarian-ish, if it's exactly parallel with P and Pani. It's not clear whether it has the same easy access to scalaricity or not, or maybe it did at an earlier stage. So that's also something yet to be worked out. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have only a couple of minutes for questions, but there is a longer panel discussion at the end. Please. Do you want to take any questions yourself?
As you said at the very beginning, there are some remaining problems and questions as regards these additives. It may be reasonable to look at these additives in context of some other parts of speech or some non-finites and so on, or they may somehow influence the scope of main operators. Maybe this is as well what you are working on.
So are you thinking specifically on the Hungarian side?
I was thinking about this P.
Okay.
P or Pani.
About whether they access the scalaricity, whether they have a scale associated with them or
I was
not?
just thinking that in this, like, let's say, basic simple constructions like P, they have this, they can add this concessive meaning. And they could have this similar meanings and even add something more in some, let's say, converter chain constructions affecting the scope of the main operators, of the operator on the main verb, something like that.
Right, thank you.
So in the little table at the end, you see that for marginalities still, the relevant relation is one between degrees. So I was thinking of your example with the city, right, location, where you say like Strasbourg is still in France or something. Why exactly degrees? What do you think? Why do you think that?
I mean, the sort of examples I was actually thinking of, in terms of this table, of thinking about the degrees, like something is saying something is still expensive or still hot or something. That's where I was thinking for degrees. For the
Marginality, like if you have, that's a pretty common use of this type of.
Yeah. I mean, I think it has to. It's a little bit less straightforward, but you imagine it's something like distance. So it's like distance from the border. So it's like measures of distance from the border or something like that.
Like for some, with respect to some center, right?
Right.
Reference.
Yeah. Well, so whatever the relevant point of reference about whether it counts as being part of that thing or not.
We can draw to a close there and save the rest of the discussion. Thank you. Thanks again.